Hello, everybody. Today, we are going to chat about the institutional impacts of networkism. But before we do that, a reminder, and I will put on my salesman voice here. This is presented by Roote. Roote is a delightful community of world-class systems thinkers looking to understand and build the future. If you are excited by this, please check out the Roote Fellowship or go to roote.co to learn more. Seriously, it's a great crew. Come join us. Okay, whoever you are on the internet, I hope you're doing well. Much love to you and your people. Okay, and your not people. Much love to everybody, Okay, today we are in Networkism. This is the final video about networks and internet networks and computers. We have already chatted about networkism in the big context of human history. We've chatted about the mechanisms of networkism, how it actually works. We've chatted about these direct impacts of it, of information abundance and protocols. And now we're going to chat about how networks connect to the institutions of society. We're going to chat about a lot of stuff. We're going to chat about new institutional economics, nonviolent protest. Those are ways to understand how institutions kind of operate. We'll chat about the political impact of the internet and networks. We'll think about distributed trust and how these internet platforms are part of a new system where we have trust instead of in centralized entities and decentralized entities. Then we'll talk about money and how to make money on the internet. That if you're a platform monopoly, that's how you make money. We'll talk about some sadness of user ownership, how users don't really have ownership on the internet. And it's really tough to maintain open source infrastructure. And we'll also chat about, building protocols versus platforms and how people are just building more platforms, but maybe it'd be better to build more protocols. And then finally, we'll connect it all back to the Roote system and show how it gets manifest in networks. Okay, let's dive in. So first, why are we learning about this? Well, a reminder that these direct impacts are important. Thinking about how information abundance and permissionless protocols change us in society and change our information sense making. That's really important. And also today, we're going to learn about how information is kind of used to perpetuate these systems of power, how it kind of, how information is connected to networks and governments and companies and things like that. Okay, as a reminder, before we start, you can kind of see this as like the initial impacts versus these long-term impacts of cheaper information. So a reminder that, the printing press was invented in 1440, but the impacts happened later, right? Luther's 95 Theses happened almost 100 years later in 1517, and that started the Protestant Reformation. And then some other impacts of the printing press, like, the first non-monarchy in the world, depending on how you count, was the United States, and it started in 1776. So that is, these impacts of cheaper information, it takes a long time for them to have bigger impacts in society. So we'll kind of discuss that today. I think there's a funny version of this, which is, when the internet first started, what people were doing was just taking PDFs and taking like newspapers and putting them on the internet. It was like, wow, that's amazing. But now we see, oh boy, it has these crazy or other impacts. As an example of this, of course we know that like the internet has changed advertising. You can see that with this graph from Benedict Evans, where he's showing, this is from a long time ago, 70 years ago through now. And the big black one here is how much money, percentage of US GDP that is spent on newspaper advertising. And that's like 50%, almost all this black thing. And then boom, it decreased a bunch. And then this orange-red thing is digital advertising. So it didn't used to exist at all, and now it's like 50% of all advertising is digital. So we kind of know about that. But some of these longer-term impacts are things like Black Lives Matter, which started as a hashtag and now is this movement around the world where you have people painting Black Lives Matter on streets all around the United States and the world. That's crazy. And they're very different kinds of things, right? Newspaper spending and advertising changing makes a lot of sense. You're like, okay, people used to get their attention. Newspapers used to have a lot of attention. Now that attention is going towards, Facebook and Google. Cool. Newspapers are going to get a lot less money, and online advertisers are going to get a lot more money. Cool. something like Black Lives Matter, wow, that's a hard thing to predict, that there's this new hashtag that is this new decentralized movement that is embodied in all these crazy ways. So that's what we're going to look at more today. And a way to think about this is like, what is actually more impactful today? The NAACP, the National Association of Colored People, I forgot what the other A stands for, or Black Lives Matter. And it kind of feels like something like this hashtag is more impactful. So that's weird. Okay, so to understand these long-term institutional impacts, let's first use this thing called New Institutional Economics, which sounds boring, but it's actually fun. And New Institutional Economics was first talked about by this guy, Ronald Coase, in 1937 in his paper, The Theory of the Firm. And the question that he had was, hey, if markets are so good at allocating resources, why do firms even exist? So I was like, wait a second. Why isn't everything just a market? Like, why do we even have companies? And the idea, or his result was, well, markets are really good at incentive maximization. They're really good at incentivizing people. I can say, hey, anybody, I'll pay you money to do this thing, but they're not very good at transaction costs, where you have to kind of put it out there and who knows who's going to say yes to it, whatever. Versus in a firm, where you're less good at incentive maximization. It's less, you have your employee, they're already doing their thing. So they have less kind of like maybe financial incentive there. You're not just like producing money to make them do stuff. Instead but the transaction costs, they are much more efficient in terms of transaction costs. You don't need to, with something like a market, it's like, who's going to buy this apple? I don't know. It could be anybody. Versus in a firm, it's like, look, I can just tell you, you need to make this report and you will do it. And so this idea of transaction costs versus incentives is what Coase theorized and what was true. And this gets this concept of what do we mean by an institution? An institution is just this shared story or myth that can coordinate and motivate people. So, on the motivation side, you have the motivation side, you have the coordination side. The motivation is like something like a market, really good at motivating people, less good at coordinating people. You don't really know who's going to do what. But something like a firm, wow, it is this shared story, this myth, this legal entity that is really good at coordinating people, and it's less good at motivating people, but it's still a good institution. So what are some other institutions that we can put on this little map? Well, you could put something like the state on here, which is really good at coordinating. Man, they got a great bureaucracy, but they're less good at motivating. You can put something like these new internet networks on here, where they're actually this pretty good middle ground of coordinating because things are really cheap, and they're pretty good at motivating with social signaling and with money. You could put something like religion on here as well as a thing that's good at motivating, but is less good at coordinating folks. It's more of like a decentralized idea, a decentralized meme that gets people into it. You can also think of something, we don't really need to go into blockchains, but you could think about a meme as another kind of institution. Something like hashtag Black Lives Matter. It's not that good at motivating people. It's not that good at coordinating people. But if you were to add a Z-axis here, wow, memes are cheap, right? Just saying hashtag Black Lives Matter and putting that on the internet, that's really cheap. And so it's kind of, you get a whole community based off of it because it's just so cheap. So you can think of this by comparing these institutions and being like, which one has more power? Something like Christianity is a religion. It has 2.4 billion people. That's a lot. Facebook is a network and has 2.2 billion monthly active users. That's a lot. China is a state and has 1.4 billion people. Bitcoin is a blockchain that has, at the time of my writing here, $125 billion market cap. And then Black Lives Matter is a meme that had 300 million tweets in 2017. So yeah, it's hard to say which one has more power, and really all these institutions are just better or worse at different things. The internet, what it did is it enabled these new kinds of institutions. So an open source community is a thing that didn't exist before. Wikipedia, this free encyclopedia, is crazy. There's a thing called Linux, which is a operating system that most of the world's servers run with. They all use Linux. And it's produced on the internet. There's just like a GitHub. Essentially, there's a lot of code, and then a lot of people can interact with that code and add or subtract new code, and then it just updates over time, and then people can use that code. And similarly with Wikipedia, it's just a lot of text files, and people can update or change those text files, and then it just keeps updating over time. And something like Wikipedia was a big deal from a new institutional economics perspective, because it had never been seen before. You would think that there was this company called Encyclopedia Britannica that existed in the 80s and 90s and stuff, and they would produce physical books, and they were trusted. They were a centralized party that was able to, coordinate really, really well, produce good encyclopedias, and make money at it. But then Wikipedia came around, and even though Wikipedia wasn't paying anybody, they had these other kinds of motivation of mastery and being part of a community and whatever. And they were really good at coordinating, essentially, that you had the networked board was able to, get people together around, was able to surface the best information on Wikipedia. So yeah, these things didn't even exist before, but now they exist on the internet. There's also new kinds of organizations that exist on the internet as another example, and this is from COVID, from coronavirus. And you can see this, an old institution like a company, the mask company 3M. They produce, at the time of this writing, it was 25 million masks per week, which is a lot of masks. And they were founded a long time ago, so it's like an old thing that has been really spun up, and boom, you have the company really good at coordinating people. Let's go, let's get to work, let's make the factory. Versus this thing called open source COVID medical supplies, which was producing 1 million masks per week, which is still a lot of masks. And they were only founded, a couple months ago, March 10th. And, the things that they're built on, 3D printing and Facebook, they barely even existed 10 years ago. So this is a new example of this new kind of decentralized network, a new kind of institution, which is just like a Facebook group that motivates and coordinates people to produce stuff. And yeah, so we're seeing more and more of these today. As another example here, there's this hashtag called Masks for All, and I asked a question on Twitter. It said, hey, did Masks for All actually have an impact on the CDC's announcement? The CDC recently announced that, hey, we should all use masks. And I said, more likely the CDC made a decision without thinking about the hashtag/movement, right? The CDC is a government entity. They're just doing their thing. But actually, this guy, Jeremy Howard, who was a key part of the Masks for All movement, he said, yes, it did. I have firsthand knowledge. He's saying that, hey, this decentralized hashtag actually had an impact on the U.S. government's, Center for Disease Control response to a global pandemic. That's crazy. And the whole idea with this is that it's really a bottom-up versus top-down vibe here. You have this, as a great example of this, you have Greta Thunberg, who is leading this movement called Fridays for Future. And these global, protests on September 20th, in I think 2019, they're definitely 2019, there were 4 million protesters around the world in all of these locations, like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 locations. That 4 million protesters is like 100th of the world, or sorry, 1,000th of the world. That's a lot of people protesting about climate change, all coordinated by just a hashtag. So that institutional economics frame is very helpful as a way to think about the internet and how it can coordinate people and motivate people in new ways that it hadn't before, and especially can do it very cheaply. Another helpful perspective here is that of nonviolent protest. And I'm going to reference these two books. This is An Uprising and this amazing book by Zeynep Tufekci called Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Networked Protest. And the idea here is, so Zeynep Tufekci was looking at why the Arab Spring happened, and why it both happened really quickly, but also kind of puttered out pretty quickly as well. So she's saying, hey, there's a lot of power, but it's also fragile, this new kind of networked protest. And the idea is that, you have, in a protest situation, protests are determined in the nonviolent protest literature by their signals and their capacities. And what that means is the signals are what the protest uses to kind of signal to the government or to the big institutions, hey, we're angry or whatever. It's like, let's get all these people together. Let's make this big protest. And an example of this is, in a Tahrir Square, 100,000 people getting together over Facebook. It's like, boom, let's get here. A lot easier because it's all just based off of information. Or, this Fridays for Future thing, it's easier to get all the protesters to kind of come and show up. The capacity side is a lot harder. So in a nonviolent protest, if you want to continue as a nonviolent protest, as a movement, you can't just have one big protest and then be done with it. You have to develop these long-term capacities to really interact with and negotiate with the state, kind of. And that requires capital. It requires hierarchy. It requires organization. And so the internet's less good at that. It's like, for something like Black Lives Matter, it's like, okay, we have this amazing hashtag that everybody's into. Well, how does that hashtag, is it a nonprofit? Is it a company? Who's leading it? Questions like that are more difficult. And so the way to think about this is that, from a network nonviolent protest perspective, as Zeynep says in her book, that the internet enabled fragile, powerful but fragile protests where it got people together quickly, but didn't have these long-term capacities, this long-term capacity building that you need money for, and you need capital and organization. And so the long-term prediction here, by the way, is that it will be that things like blockchain will be able to help here. Again, not trying to be a blockchain maximalist, but thinking about how the internet, if you have these protocols for value, then people will be able to coordinate around those protocols for value more easily, so that something like hashtag Black Lives Matter has baked into it a Black Lives Matter coin or something like that allows that movement, allows people to buy into it, allows people to have this kind of natural money that is connected to it, which allows that protest to actually gain more strength. And so we've seen that as a weird, funny example of this. There's this thing called Dogecoin, which is Doge is an internet meme, and I'm sad I don't have the picture for it here. It's just this little dog on the internet, and they decided to make a coin about it and called it Dogecoin. And in theory, that's dumb and doesn't matter, but actually, people were really into this coin, and people bought a lot of it, took their US dollars and converted it to Dogecoin, and then the Dogecoin community has done a lot of good stuff with it. They sent the Jamaican bobsled team to the Olympics. They've helped a lot of people with cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So those are weird proto examples of blockchain and cryptocurrencies being an online kind of digitally native solution to having capital attached to your movement. Okay, so nonviolent protest is a helpful frame. The other helpful, moving to something completely different now, is this idea of politics and how the internet interacts with politics. I think the easiest way to think about this is that aggregation theory breaks this idea of the party decides. So there's this theory in political science called the party decides, and it's true and not true in a variety of ways, but generally what it says is you have this stuff on the left here, which is the party, where you have politicians and donors and everybody, and what they can do is they can interact with everybody else. They can interact with newspapers. They have access to newspapers. They can spend money on editorials and advertising. They can, talk directly to the individuals with their Get Out the Vote campaign, GOTV, and that is cool. And what happened, though, is that we switched to this version of the internet where it's aggregation theory. You have something like Facebook, which is just this kind of neutral platform that just has aggregated all these customers, all these users on one side that, scroll through their news feed. And then in that situation, the party used to have all this power. It used to be able to connect with newspapers. It had, connect with advertisers. It would connect with, the people with the Get Out the Vote campaigns. But now the party is just like all these other news outlets over here. And the party is also just like the Donald. It's just like Donald Trump. Everybody goes through Facebook. Everybody just goes through Twitter. And it doesn't really matter if you are the party, the traditional party. It's like what shows up high on your Facebook feed is actually what matters. And the Donald has the same competitive, set as a traditional, long-term party there. So even though the Republican Party was like, we don't want Donald Trump, please no. The Donald was just like, look, I'm just going to talk directly to the people. And this is, shown by what the people said, what they liked about Donald Trump. When interviewed across all these different states, what did you like about him? Why, what do you like about Donald Trump? And everybody said, I'm not sure if you can read this here, but everybody said this top one on literally all these different states is he tells it like it is. That's what we love about him. He tells it like it is. And so that is, and by the way, all this stuff is taken from this great Stratechery article. And yeah, he tells it like it is, which means that, everybody, both Donald and the party, the old school party, they all just talk directly to their people through Twitter, through Facebook. And Donald, like him or dislike him, he's just really good at Twitter. He's just yelling at people and doing whatever on Twitter, and the people love it. He tells it like it is, and people are into it. And so that power of authenticity on the internet is crazy, and it's both someone like Donald Trump does it, but also other folks do it. So this is Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the United States, and both of them are really well known for being very authentic and just speaking to the people through, for Jacinda, it's through Facebook Live, and through AOC on the right, it's through Instagram. So they're just both really good. Just like the Donald is really good at being himself on Twitter, Jacinda and AOC are really good at being themselves over Facebook and Instagram. And so the same idea happened when other information mediums came about, like people having a really good radio voice or someone being a really powerful speaker on television. And so too is it with these folks, where it's like, look, the people love charisma, and you can express your charisma in a variety of ways, and it now happens through the internet, through these platforms. So this is all to say, the platforms are optimized for, and the politics is kind of optimized for charismatic people, and now those charismatic people can talk directly to their constituents through the internet instead of going through these old systems of newspapers and editorials, et cetera, et cetera. And someone like Washington Post calls this "Democracy Dies in the Darkness." That is their tagline. Okay, so now let's chat about how the internet, this is the idea of platforms, or the idea of, government, this very trusted institution becoming a lot less trusted. That's very connected to this idea of distributed trust and this move from centralized trust to distributed trust. So there's this beautiful book by Rachel Botsman called Who Can You Trust? And what she says in it is that, we have this evolution of trust in society. We used to have just local trust. Back when you were in your little local hunter-gatherer tribes, you just knew the people around you. And so you had these natural skin in the game incentives for people to trust each other. And then we moved towards institutional trust, where you had trust in these big, centralized institutions, banks and governments and academic institutions and the church and religion. And those things, you had your trust. Right now, even I trust my bank. It's like, okay, generally, I'm going to put my money in there, and then I'm going to be able to take it out in the future. And they have a nice, good ledger, and they're keeping my money safe. And so that's how institutional trust works. It's trust in these big institutions. But now we're moving to distributed trust. And distributed trust is, trust based in networks that happens, kind of natively through the internet. So as some examples of this, let's do the examples first and then go back to that other one. There are, let's talk about this first. You can think of this as a transition from, for a long time, from 200,000 BC, from a long time ago, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, whatever, you had local trust used to be really large. Everybody used to trust each other locally. And then we had this really big increase in centralized trust, and just in institutional trust. And now, with the rise of the internet, you have this increase in decentralized and distributed trust. And this graph, by the way, it goes to 2200 because it shows, hey, we are just at the decentralized trust is just now on the rise, and it is likely to be the case that it continues to rise because it's just at the very beginning of its journey. Okay, so let's look at some examples of this trust. Back in the day, you would trust a hotel. You would say, I want to go to that really nice looking hotel. I trust it. I know the brand name. That sounds great. And now it sounded crazy at the time to trust, sleeping on someone's couch. But now you can trust someone like Airbnb. They say you trust the platform. They have a bunch of things in place. You look at the ratings of the person. They have nice pictures. Boom. You sleep on that person's couch or bed or whatever. Similarly with cars. You used to trust the yellow. They were all yellow. They had taxi medallions. The trust was in, this old system, this centralized taxi medallion system. And now, boom, Uber. It's just like, yo, are you going to get in this random person's car? Well, maybe not. Now that I see that they have a 5-star rating and they have a nice car and that Uber checks them, et cetera, oh, cool. I will get in this random person's car. And so that is a new kind of distributed trust. Getting in somebody else in the network, you're just going to get in their car because you trust the person through their ratings and because you trust the platform itself. And then similarly, of course, you had these old trusted newspapers, stuff like Time Magazine, which I think still exists. I'm not really sure. And now you have trust in these big platforms where it's like, okay, where are you going to get your information? Twitter. I trust Twitter. So yeah, there's this shift in how trust is, from these centralized platforms to these new decentralized platforms, or centralized brands rather. And this has happened already with those sharing economy things, but it's going to happen in bigger ways with these other big centralized trusted institutions. So we got banks, we got education, universities, we got government, and all of these things on the left side, they are centralized and traditionally trusted. Again, all of these have a lot less trust than they used to. Traditionally trusted institutions. You can tell even all of them have the same Roman columns, right? It's like, we are trusted. Why? Because we are connected to Rome. And that's transitioning to these weird new kinds of distributed trust where, something like Bitcoin and Ethereum and these cryptocurrencies, they are able to create a distributed ledger where you trust that distributed ledger and kind of trust the network. Your trust is in all these miners and all these other folks that are part of this distributed network, and you kind of trust the computers there to run everything correctly, and so you will actually put your money in Bitcoin and trust that it will not be stolen or what have you. Something like education, there's a lot of examples of this, but as an easy example, something like Khan Academy. Instead of going to some trusted big institution like Harvard or whatever, maybe you can get similar or even better information from the internet, from Khan Academy. There are other incentives at play there, by the way, like status and stuff, but we won't get into that. And then finally with government, you have these governments do a lot of things. They're very connected to banks. They print money, but they also provide a lot of public goods like roads and things. And they also have a monopoly on violence. And so that's a lot of different things that they do, but we might start to see some of those things be done in a more decentralized way. So with something like, money, Bitcoin and Ethereum being an example of distributed trust there, and with things like providing public goods, we are starting to see this with, a more robust nonprofit ecosystem. So yeah, expect more change here. Okay, so moving away from institutions as in this concept of trust, we're going to just talk for a second about how these digital institutions perpetuate themselves and how they make money. And this is, how do they do it? Well, it's by being a platform monopoly. That's how you do it. And as a reminder here, the reason why we're talking about this is because, remember 2 episodes ago when we were talking about, seeing like a networked human organism and how if you have any system, that system, in order to survive, it needs to continue to perpetuate itself. If you have if you have a cat that doesn't have any other cats around it, well, that cat's eventually going to die and bye-bye cat. But if the cat can reproduce, well, boom, there can be more cats in the future. And similarly with something like companies where, for individuals, they need energy to continue perpetuating themselves. I as a human need more energy and I need that to continue living. But something like a company, what it needs is money. It needs more and more money to continue growing. And so that's why we ask this question of, okay, on the internet, how do people make money? How do these things grow? And it's weird because on the internet, making money in physical world is kind of simple. It's like, okay, I have this box of stuff for you. Great, you pay me money for it. And maybe I made this box for $10 and I'm selling it to you for $20, and so I made $10 off of this thing. Great. Well, and I can't sell that box to someone else, right? It's like I gave you the box. That is called a rivalrous good, because I can give it to you, but I can't also give it to someone else. But in the digital world, well, I can just take my bits, and if I'm like, hey, here's this YouTube video, here it is, please pay me money for it. And you're like, wait a second, why am I paying you money for this? You can just copy that information a bunch of times and send it to anywhere else. Why am I paying you money for something that can just be copied infinite times? So that is weird. That's why it's weird to make money on the internet. So how do they make money? Well, it comes back to this idea of thin protocols and fat applications, where the protocols don't make money. There's no money making for TCP/IP, but the applications on top make a lot of money. Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. And so here's 3 ways they do it. The first is with advertising, where they essentially suck your time, and then once they get your time, then they use it to show you stuff that might meet your needs. And so someone like Google is really good at this. Someone like Facebook is really good at this. They have solved a job that we need to be done, which is finding good stuff on the internet or connecting with friends on the internet. And then once they've solved that job, they keep us on their sites, and then they occasionally show us some ads that we might want. And so that's how they make money. So again, so many of our huge companies make money in this way. It's just advertising, especially if at scale. That's how you make money. Another way to do it is to sell atoms. So e-commerce, it's tough to sell bits because bits cost $0. But someone like Amazon, what they do is they get you to go to their site and they say, hey, I'm going to sell you stuff, but I'm going to sell you physical things. I'm going to sell you these atoms. I'm going to sell you this t-shirt, and we'll take a little bit of the money from that. And so e-commerce is another way to make money on the internet, is really to just use the internet as a means for selling goods, for selling atoms. The final way to make money on the internet is with software as a service, or SaaS. And what that means is it's essentially you're selling access to an API. So for example here, there's this thing called Stripe, which allows you to move money on the internet. And Stripe, you have to kind of paste every time you use Stripe, or every time you use PayPal or whatever, they take 30 cents of the transaction and also 3% of the fees. They take 30 cents as a fee and then 3% of the total cost. And that's kind of weird because it's like, wait a second, I'm just sending these bits over the internet. Why are you charging me for this? But they also built a lot of this stuff, and they have this platform, not a protocol, not an open permissionless protocol. They have a platform that says, look, if you want to use one of our APIs, if you want to send money through PayPal, you got to pay PayPal. If you want to send money through Stripe, you got to pay Stripe. So, and you can do it as a service. You can just do it as many times as you want. You sell access to that API. So that is the third way to make money off the internet, is with SaaS, with software as a service. And because these are the only ways to make money off the internet, it means that, and because of this permissionless nature that we talked about before, we get these network effects, these massive network effects, which means that more people get excited by something and start to use that thing, and then that thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And before you know it, you have these massive companies that control all the power. And that also means that venture capitalists, when they're funding new things, they're only shooting for unicorns, right? You don't really, if you're a VC, you could invest money in this thing, but if it's not going to be Facebook, well, is it really worth investing in? And that's because all of the returns for venture capitalists, back to this graph here, if you look at this one on the right, 4 out of the top 5 are these massive, massive companies: Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. If you're a venture capitalist, you want to invest in something that can give you that 1,000x return, that grand slam. You don't want to invest in something that's just going to give you a 2x return. You really want to get something that can win really, really big. So you're searching for these monopolies. So that is how you make money off the internet. The issue or some of the sad things with this is that, that users provide so much value, but they have no ownership. This is sad. Something like Facebook with this Facebook graph. I mean, Facebook, it's 2 billion people on Facebook. You have all these people. And the value of Facebook, some of it obviously is created by the company and the coders and whatever, but a lot of it is like, for me, I get so much value from all my friends being on Facebook and by them producing funny cat videos or interesting content or whatever. But they don't get money for that, It just, who gets money? Well, Facebook gets money from it because the advertisers pay Facebook for our eyeballs. And that is okay, but mostly sad. And let's look at how we did things with the Atoms frontier to understand why this is sad. So ownership of the Atoms frontier, how did that work? You had this new frontier of atoms, and there are all these atoms out there, and you're like, okay, sweet, we want to take these atoms, we want to develop them, put them through some factories, do some stuff, make some money from them, whatever. And this frontier, this especially, and I'll use America as an example here, the United States, how did we actually develop this? Well, what we could have done is we could have just said, okay, companies can do whatever they want, they can take this frontier and just develop it and make all the money. Also, as a side note here, I would want to say that this frontier is connected to, obviously it was not a frontier. There were lots of Native Americans and folks living there beforehand that Americans, my ancestors killed and did horrible things to in order to develop that frontier. They exploited it, but they also developed it. In any case, so what did we do? We gave some of that frontier to the public. It was amazing. There's this Land Grant Act in 1862 that said, look, if you want to start a university, boom, we'll give you some land to start it. That's amazing. And so there were so many colleges and universities that were created through these land grants, where it's like, look, we as the United States of America, we want a good public education company. We care about future us. And so we're going to say, you know what, there's a lot of frontier out there, but we're not just going to give it to the companies. We're going to set aside just a little bit of it to allow these new, for universities and for educating the humans of the future. That's going to be great. So it's for the public. Another example of this is the Homestead Act, which, of all these acres out there, of the 270 million acres, 9 to 30% of it was settled with this act. And what this act did is it said, hey, if you're a person who lives in the East Coast, who lives out here, we'll allow you to go out west here. And if you spend 5 years on some land and develop it into, start farming on it, maybe put a little, mill on it or whatever, if you do that, we'll give you the land. So this was an amazing way to create public ownership of this frontier. 30% or 10 to 30% of the land says, you know what? The U.S. government said, we're going to give that to the public. We're going to give that to the people as long as they develop it. Compare this to the bits frontier. How much of the bits frontier was given to the public? How much of this new internet world was given to the public? Not much, unfortunately. If you think about something like Facebook or Google, something like Facebook here, how much of that is designated for the public good? If you think about the Atoms frontier, oh, cool, we're going to give this stuff for universities, for education. We're going to give this stuff for humans. If you for the individuals, if you want to settle this, you can have the land. But for Facebook, it's like, nope, your whole screen, is just filled up with stuff that makes Facebook money, essentially, stuff that keeps you on the site and makes them more money. So that is sad. Another way to think about this is who captured the value. Well, value was captured and it accrued to the people who captured it. So this is a bunch of billionaires. These are billionaires in the world. This is like, many of the top 25 or 15 or whatever. Jeff Bezos, 150 billion, Bill Gates, 100 billion, Mark Zuckerberg, 70 billion. All these folks are just the Google people, Microsoft people, Oracle. They made a ton of money. And the reason for that is because someone like Mark Zuckerberg, obviously he did, and again, Mark, if you're listening to this video, I think you did great work. You worked really hard. And this number's wrong, by the way. It was 70 billion from this article, but it's now 100 billion. And you did great work, Mark. And you made a company worth $750 billion. That's how much the market value of Facebook is now. But should Mark Zuckerberg get $100 billion of that? Should he get, more than 10%? Did he really, if you think about the value created for Facebook, 2 billion users, all those employees. Okay, it just feels wrong that the value creation, maybe Mark Zuckerberg created, even if he created 1/10,000th of the value, that would be crazy. But no, the amount of money that we've given to him is a tenth. We've said, no, you get the amount of value that you get to capture from this value creation exercise is you get more than 10% of it. So that's just wrong. So the bits frontier versus the atoms frontier, it's an issue because right now we don't have internet ownership. We don't have the protocols for value on the internet yet. And so that means that the people that got to capture the value captured it in a very specific way. And there are people that won this monopoly battle, became these huge aggregators, and then as a result of the venture capital model, just got to capture lots and lots of that money. Okay, that's sad. Another sad thing is that open source infrastructure isn't well funded, that these digital roads and bridges are neglected. So the idea here is you can imagine, our physical world has all these roads and bridges that we put money towards. We say, look, it's a public, people should be able to transport around the world. You should be able to go places, and we're going to put some highways there so that you can go around, or we'll put some public transport there so you can move around. But our digital roads and bridges, and this is from Nadia Egbal, who wrote a great book about this recently, these digital roads and bridges, they're totally neglected. All these open source infrastructure projects, they get essentially $0, and it's very hard for them to capture any value as well. So as some examples of this, there's this heartbleed bug in OpenSSL, and SSL is this way to send money securely over the internet, and there was this bug in it, and there was estimated to be $500 million of damage in this bug, and it was like, oh God, who's responsible for this? Who did this bad thing? Well, the issue is that OpenSSL is just an open source project, and just a few volunteers maintain it. So you had companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc., making tons and tons of money. And then how much of that money, and they're making it on top of protocols and open source infrastructure, etc. But then the value capturing machines, only value capturing machines are for attention economy stuff. And so, they capture the value, and someone like OpenSSL is just neglected. And so what you get is a few volunteers maintaining it in their free time. Just at nights and weekends. And of course they missed it. But this crazy thing is that this OpenSSL thing, this is how all e-commerce on the internet happens, is through this OpenSSL protocol. And so this was a big issue. It's just an indication of the economics on the internet being broken, being deeply broken. Another example is Instagram, which is a cool thing. It sold for $1 billion to Facebook after 2 years. 13 employees, 30 million users at the time. Amazing, cool app. But it was built deeply on open source, right? There are Python as a language is open source. There's a lot of the stack, the Linux stack is all open source. There's a lot of things, a lot of these languages, Ruby on Rails, they're open source. And all of that open source from that $1 billion acquisition, it's like, oh, okay, sweet. Maybe we should then push some of that money to different people who contributed value here. No, what actually happens is that that $1 billion goes to those 13 employees and to the venture capital investors. That's sad. Again, I think that some of the money should go to those folks, but I just think it's clear that we need better mechanisms here for distributing value to open source protocols and open source projects. As a funny example of this, Wikipedia. Oof. Every year, Jimmy Wales comes on, the founder, and says, hey, you got to give us money. We are like the top, they're like in the top 10 most visited websites on the internet, which is amazing. They do amazing work. Someone like YouTube, when YouTube is trying to deal with conspiracy theories, they actively link to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a great thing. But how do they make money? Well, they don't. They're just run totally off donations, and they have to beg every year and say, please give us money. Or else, we're so helpful for all of society. Lots of people use us. YouTube, a company that makes tons of money, uses us. But please give us money. So this is just another example of, sad internet economics. A final way to think about this is Yeah, what's going to happen in the future with platforms versus protocols? Something that's happening today with the COVID pandemic is everybody's using video conferencing platforms. And so you have Zoom and Skype and Microsoft Teams and WebEx, and all of them are battling versus each other. And the question here is it actually, if you think from a networked human organism perspective, the networked human organism definitely wants video conferencing software. A crucial part of being a good networked species is people to be able to talk to each other in a video way. Is the best way to get at that through a bunch of companies competing with each other, developing very similar code bases, and then competing with each other and then having new people pop up that are relatively similar with a little bit of a difference? I'm not sure. I think it would be amazing if we were able to create more shared protocols or shared infrastructure that these companies were able to collaboratively work on, and then we're able to kind of put user interfaces on top of. But right now we just can't do that because there's no incentive to build a new protocol. There's no incentive. And so everybody ends up trying to just capture more market share from other folks, building similar things, but a little bit different to capture more of the video conferencing market share. That's sad. As a final note here, moving away from money and how money works on the internet, we're going to chat about the Roote system and how it is manifest in networks. The crucial idea here is just kind of in a wrap-up mode, is that we have these new networks. They are these new kinds of institutions, massive platforms like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and also things like Wikipedia, Black Lives Matter. And the idea is that when you have other things that are happening in society, you're like, oh, that new thing, let's call it, the civil rights movement, that eventually gets moved into laws in the Civil Rights Act of 1963 or 65. What we also have now is these ideas being manifest in code and being manifest in these networks. So that's the idea here. And you can imagine it like these other parts of the Roote system, which we will talk about soon, coherent pluralism. This idea that you should both be pluralistic in how much stuff you consume and be coherent among it, that can be manifest in code. You can imagine a red feed, blue feed, where you consume things from one perspective and from the other perspective at the same time. Something like bentoism, not only caring about now me, but also caring about future us. You can imagine that being represented in networks, where in addition to a new ethical framework like caring about climate change being put into being put into laws, like these like summits, these Paris IPCC, Paris climate change summits, and stuff like carbon taxes. You can also imagine these new ethics of like, oh, let's care about future us, let's care about climate change. Maybe that goes into code and says anytime anybody purchases a plane ticket on the internet, we automatically do a carbon offset. Boom, easy enough. So you can imagine ethics being implemented in code as well and implemented in networks. Finally, this abundance and generosity piece here, that is this idea of generosity can be implemented in networks as well. With the COVID pandemic, there were a lot of people using these, using Google spreadsheets, using mutual aid groups, using Facebook to just give money to other people on the internet. People were just putting up their Venmo handles and being like, hey, I could use some money here. And people were just sending them money. So these are all examples of when we think about something like networkism, it's the creation of these new institutions and those new decentralized institutions battling the old centralized ones. And it's the idea that all these mindsets, our new epistemological frame of coherent pluralism, our new ethical frame of bentoism, those things get embodied both in traditional institutions like nation states and laws, but also in these new internet networks and in code. Okay. So, what do network-based institutions feel like in your body? I'm laughing because I'm tired. Usually I don't, Usually when I think here, I go, ah. But this time I went, I did. The whole head went down. This is a lot. There's just a lot happening here. And I think it's a little scary. This idea that decentralized institutions that have created so much stability for society, banks, governments, academic institutions, that they're all perhaps moving to these new decentralized forms. It's scary, and especially when you get violence in there. How violence gets moved from this monopoly of violence situation that we have today with governments and police and military to a new decentralized worlds. And when people in power lose their power and when militaries lose power, that's going to be a lot. So I think it is inevitable, though, and I think we should try to make it as much of an evolution and as little of a revolution as possible. As quickly as possible, but also not be too crazy about it. Okay, interactive time. So besides the attention economy, e-commerce, and SaaS, how else can you make money on the internet? That is a good question. How am I making money, for example? Second question, how should governments engage with technology? Is a big question. You can think of this similar to like when the printing press came along, how did the church interact with it? Well, how should the governments engage with the internet? There's lots of sub-pieces here. There's lots of delicious worlds of public interest technology, gov tech, etc. that I recommend checking out. Okay, so this is what we chat about today. These first big ones were like using this institutional economics and nonviolent protest frames to understand how the internet has impacted institutions. We looked at how specifically it's impacted politics and this new ability to speak directly to people. And we looked at all of that as this shift in distributed trust from centralized to decentralized institutions. Finally, we chat about, 5 through 8 here, all about money on the internet and how it's just not equitably or correctly distributed, that we need better ways to capture value and to capture value on the internet. And right now, lots of value is being created that we don't capture directly or correctly. And especially, it's so sad to compare it to the atoms-based world, where we did a better job, maybe. And then finally, we chat about how the Roote System is manifest in networks, how new mindsets are manifest in other institutions, but also in these new networks. Okay, so what will it feel like to integrate your learning? And what should you watch out for? Well, you'll start to see, this new institutional economics lens allows you to say, wait a second, why are people joining something like these new movements? How are they being motivated to join this thing? Or are they motivated, through altruistic reasons, caring about future us, like a climate change march? Are they motivated for their own personal, financial reasons, social signaling reasons, whatever? What are they getting out of joining some institution? Oh, it's just a job. Cool. They get money, whatever. You can also think about the coordinating side, where it's like, wait a second, how is this thing actually coordinating people? Is it like a top-down thing where you have someone in the hierarchy, your boss, telling you to do something? Or is it in a bottom-up way? Like Black Lives Matter. How do they coordinate? That's really interesting. You can start to see all these crowd prefixes show up, where it's like crowdsourcing, or everything just uses the crowd now because you can connect in this zero marginal cost way. Yeah, you'll also start to see this distributed versus centralized trust system, where especially as you see centralized systems, what are their signals versus what is the reality? So a signal that a lot of these centralized things use is, these Roman columns. Like, oh, we are important. We have a Roman column. You should trust us. But should you actually trust them? But similarly on the internet, it's like if you just see a good rating on the internet, is that a signal or is that reality? Like, how much should you trust this Airbnb location, for example? You'll also when you really start to integrate your learning, you'll be sad. I'm so sad about internet monetization that we have a bad system for for capturing value on the internet. Our creating value systems are bad as well. Like we should, move towards this age of wisdom and age of knowledge more. But our capturing value systems are just totally broken. So that's sad. And things to watch out for. Centralized institutions can be good, right? I think that to some extent I am a, internet maximalist or whatever, but actually a lot of centralized institutions are amazing at stuff. I mean, if you look at the COVID pandemic and someone like New Zealand, wow, they did, the government there did an amazing job of saying, look, people, you got to be good here. We're going to set these laws in place. We're going to set good norms in our society. Let's go. Let's, if you do a bad thing, we're going to fine you. So since some centralized institutions can be really good, some companies can be really good. They're very efficient at doing things. So understanding when the centralized institution is good versus when you want a bottom-up approach is good. And the other thing to watch out for is, thinking that all this stuff is going to happen too quickly. So as an example here, it's like we're still probably a far way away from quote-unquote governments toppling. Occasionally it'll move very quickly. Like when it does happen, it'll be like, oh boy, like, Berlin Wall fell in a day. It didn't, the USSR, fell. There was a lot of, these are complex systems. And there's this book called The Collapse of Complex Societies, which shows how complexity happens. Oh, and then the thing collapses. So it will move slowly and then it'll move very quickly, but mostly it'll move pretty slowly. So to conclude here, what if, concluding this idea of networkism, we chatted about a lot. We chatted about, in the first video, this big perspective of, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, information revolution, and how we have this new emerging networked human organism that we hope will be this new thing that we're able to create in this beautiful, wise way. And we also chatted about, how to understand these networks and, these protocols and this, information abundance and how that can be, some of these direct impacts are both very good and very bad. There's lots of information now, but some of it's bad, some of it's good. And also we have these permissionless protocols, which is cool because there's no friction, but maybe there should be more friction in these systems. We have these massive winners, but also we have these long tail that's kind of beautiful. And then today we chat about, these institutions and how, wow, the government or, the information has this impact on, how institutions work and the kinds of ways that people motivate and coordinate with each other. And also that some of our internet institutions and how the internet makes money and can, does its money thing is not great. So we've chatted about all that. And I think the vision here, and let me check here. Yeah, the vision is that, we can take this new thing that is emerging, this networked human organism and these new underlying processes, and we can hopefully move towards this age of wisdom and this age of knowledge where the internet is used as this beautiful place to help people learn about themselves and the people around them, where companies and governments and everybody has like a little bit of pieces of the internet that's not as dominated by these massive platforms that are just profit maximizing, that open source infrastructure is supported, and that people are creating new protocols and collaborating more over new things instead of competing all the time. And that, in the future, we just, when you imagine a child in 2100, that they grow up with this beautiful internet that is not showing them hate speech, and it's showing them this beautiful world, and they get scaffolded into this beautiful, connection to this, to humanity, to nature, to each other, to, the machines. And they then start to, when they grow up, they start to add to that thing. They become part of the crowd and participate in it and start to help build new protocols, new layers that continue to make our information sense making as an organism better and better. So that, I think, is the vision. Thank you so much for listening today, Let me know if you have any comments or feedback or questions. Again, if you like this stuff, check out the Roote Fellowship and check us out at roote.co. Thank you and goodbye.